There's really, thinking about this, sort of 4 myths that I thought that I could explore today, and would allow us time for some discussion and questions about them. I hope you find it of some interest. The first one that I think we can look at seriously is what I've called by shorthand here, the Irish Parliamentary Party myth. And this was an idea put together by many constitutional nationalists, and Willie Redmond is a name that will be familiar to many of you. And the idea that a lot of the Irish Parliamentary Party nationalist MPs had was that shared service by Ulster Unionists and Irish nationalists in the trenches in France and Belgium would then lead to a better awareness of each other's views on the Home Rule crisis, and would then mean that Home Rule could be introduced for the Island of Ireland as a whole at the end of the war. This would break down all the barriers. That's something that Willie Redmond talks about quite a lot in various speeches. He writes about it in the Daily Chronicle, and on his death, the journalism that he puts together in the Chronicle is collected together in that book, Trench Pictures from France. My copy I luckily picked up at the second-hand bookshop in Belfast for £6, because the guy selling it didn't realise Redmond had anything to do with Ireland and had it in the General Military History section. That tells us something which is quite interesting too about the Battle of Messines. And the audience today, I mean, we could say perhaps 12:30 in the day as a time that only really suits, you know, the pensioners, the long-term unemployed, the criminally insane, Belfast City Council staff, police staff. But you know, this is another aspect. I think that the Battle of Messines hasn't got the popular attention the Battle of Somme has. You know, when we were doing Somme talks last year, we were getting crowds of 50. Well, maybe since they heard it, they thought they didn't want to hear anything more. But there is something too about sort of Messines and the Somme and how this all works out. So the sort of unionist myth about the Battle of the Somme, the idea that it's only the Ulster Division taking part, that, you know, it's a very old hoary myth that's been exploded many times, doesn't really come up so much to do with the Battle of Messines. So it's more this one about the Irish Parliamentary Party that we'll look at. So I'll say more about this shortly. We then move on to what I've termed the peace process myth. And there's the Irish Island of Ireland Peace Tower. I don't know how many of you have been there, the senior Messines. And this, I think, in some ways rather unwittingly, simply repeats the IPP line. It's something along the lines of, well, if nationalists and unionists could get on together in the trenches in Belgium, why can't we get on better now? So this is unveiled in 1998 and pushes that argument. It's quite an odd enterprise, I think. I'll say a lot more about it later. You don't get a nice cup of tea there as you live in the Ulster Tower. There's no knowledgeable caretaker or curator to bring you around the place. Yes, I'm aware of who my audience is here today. So there's a sort of problem there, and what's it there for? But also it's a strange attempt, I think, by the Irish government to reach out to loyalist paramilitaries. So it's quite an odd sort of peace building endeavour in that way. And I think the timing of it didn't quite work for various reasons. So I'll come back to that later on. So they're the sort of 2 big Irish myths we can think of: the IPP myth that's contemporary, peace process myth that's coming in the 1990s. We can then think more broadly about the sort of performance of the British Army. And apologies if Tom's covered a bit of this last week with you already. There is what we could call the British military incompetence myth. The idea extolled so well in the TV series Blackadder, that really the British Army just keeps making the same mistakes over and over and over again, and that the scene is really a bit like the Somme and very much like Passchendaele, and it's just another bloodbath. So that's one myth we can look at. Now, to counter that, there's another one that comes in more recently, which those of us in the University of Kent talk about as being linked to the West Midlands axis, which is, of course, the universities of Birmingham and Wolverhampton, led by Gary Sheffield, where they talk about this idea of a learning curve and suggest that things are getting consistently better for the British Army over time. I think that's also a myth. Again, I'll look at all these in more detail, but Cyril Falls, when he was writing about the Ulster Division, said that the operation at Messines was essentially as good as it got for the division. It wasn't that things then got better, or Passchendaele got better from 1918, that the sort of peak of any learning process for the Ulster Division was seen in June 1917. So both of those ideas about the performance of the British Army are also ones that we should think about seriously there. So I'll turn, obviously, all myths have a kernel of truth to them. which is why they get told and retold. But there are a number of problems with these, which I'll look at now. So sort of we take the first two together, this idea of the Irish Parliamentary Party, that this would bring Irishmen together and let Home Rule come in, and the other idea of the peace process myth. What lies behind this is the supposed equivalence of the 16th Irish Division and the 36th Ulster Division. The idea being that the 16th Irish Division was basically Irish nationalism in arms, and the 36th Ulster Division was basically Ulster Unionism in arms. There are great problems with that. There is certainly a lot of political engagement with recruiting in Ireland, but it doesn't work out terribly happily, particularly for Irish nationalism. So we have here a very famous poster here of John Redmond. The quote's actually from August 1915, so the ship is rather sailed by the time this one is released, if we think of the spikes of recruiting in the First World War in Ireland as in elsewhere in Britain. The real need comes in the first 6 months really of the war. The highest recruiting point for Ireland, as for GB, is in mid-September 1914. So the fact that the Redmond poster is coming out so much later than that tells you something about the hesitancy of Irish nationalism to get involved in the war. It's fair to say, I think, that John Redmond has been pretty well treated by modern historians writing about the Home Rule crisis and about the First World War. Much better treated than he was by a contemporary artist. I've looked at this poster, I don't know how many times, I still can't work out where that arm's meant to be coming from or who it belongs to. It's certainly an odd one, and the terribly unmilitary figure of John Redmond and the Kitchener pose is a very odd thing to do as well. So we have attempts by the Irish nationalists to raise recruits. And if we sort of think about the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Ulster Division briefly, when Edward Carson decides to raise the Ulster Volunteer Force, the decision is made that there will be mass recruiting meetings in Belfast. So you have parades and enrolment meetings for each of the four north, south, east and west Belfast regiments of the UVF. You then have special meetings for the young citizen volunteers to enlist. So that's all very carefully planned, carefully choreographed, and means that the UVF essentially recruits a brigade for the Kitchener's army within a couple of weeks in mid-September 1914. In rural areas it takes longer, but there are about 30 recruiting meetings through provincial Ulster and in Derry City for the Ulster Division, and by the end of October you're looking at something like 10,000 men raised. So it takes a long time to form the Ulster Division up to its full strength of 15,000. That takes us on into the spring of 1915, but in the early days there is enthusiasm, and Ulster Unionism can deliver in quite widespread numbers. For Irish nationalists, the recruiting gig is a much more difficult one, and it says a lot that there's only these formed recruiting meetings in West Belfast, in Derry City and in Enniskillen. So that's in sharp contrast to what goes on for the Ulster Volunteer Force. And you get a flavour of what the problems are with all this, with this recruiting poster, which is based on a speech by Joseph Devlin, the MP for West Belfast. You can see here that Devlin manages that very elaborate trick of encouraging men to enlist in the Irish regiments of the British Army without ever once mentioning the Irish regiments or the British Army. So men are asked to join the Irish Brigade, so resonances of the old Irish Brigade in the French Army, and they're asked to be soldiers of the Allies. And that sort of shows you some of the problems within all this. Because of course Irish nationalists had opposed British involvement in the South African War, so there was a sort of long-standing problem there. There have been a lot of campaigns, more by advanced nationalists than by the Irish Parliamentary Party itself, against recruiting in peacetime between 1902 and 1914. So this sort of reverses the position of Irish nationalism to some degree, and that remains very problematic. It remains problematic for any number of reasons. I'll touch on a few of them. One is really that you've got the Irish National Volunteers that are about 180,000 strong. There are a lot of concerns in the press in Ireland that these men are going to be conscripted. There's an idea that the British government is going to bring in the Militia Act, and that they're going to be conscripted into the army. So that causes a lot of hesitancy and a dropping away in volunteer parades and so on. It takes a long time too for John Redmond, Joseph Devlin and others to resolve the control of the Irish Volunteers. There's that split within the Irish National Volunteers and the Irish Volunteers. Irish National Volunteers about 160,000, Irish Volunteers about 10,000, and it's that smaller splinter group that ends up being the radical element that's involved in the Easter Rising. So a lot of the meetings that are being held in August, September, and indeed into early October are to make sure that the Irish Parliamentary Party controls the Irish National Volunteers. They're not actually recruiting meetings for the British Army, so there's a problem within the politics of all this for Redmond, and some have said that the first step in the process of the collapse of the Irish Parliamentary Party is that Redmond can't bring the Irish National Volunteers with him entirely, that there is this fracture within the organisation. So that then means that these recruiting meetings aren't really being held until November 1914. After the peak of recruiting has been reached elsewhere in the UK, so that leads to problems. In terms of how they're organised, we get 3 recruiting meetings in West Belfast that seem to be very much down to Joe Devlin, the MP for the area. So these are not centrally organised by Irish National Volunteer headquarters in Dublin, they're local endeavours. The other ones are even more interesting. Up in Derry City, it's a chap called C.J. McManus who starts recruiting. He had been commander of one of the battalions of the Irish National Volunteers up there, and he turns up and seems to have recruited about 200 men as an off in November. He later claims to have recruited 900 in total from the Irish National Volunteers there. And his file's fascinating at the National Archives over in Kew, in that he had been a private soldier in the Brigade of Guards. He was working as an insurance agent before the outbreak of the war, and is basically recommissioned very hurriedly as a captain because he's brought these recruits in. Only later on do they work out this is the same C.J. McManus who had been promoted to corporal and broken back to the ranks about 12 times because he seemed to be hitting the booze at a regular level when he was in the army. And later on things don't work out terribly well in his army career. He leaves the army as a captain after a court-martial case. But he certainly does a lot of recruiting up in the northwest. Later on also recruits in Belfast too. So that's a sort of local initiative with local Irish National Volunteers. The other man we have is a chap called John Ray, who starts recruiting in Enniskillen and raises about 60 recruits for the British Army through the Irish National Volunteers there. His father was the nationalist chairman of the County Council, so there's a sort of very firm political element there. And a lot of this seems to be to do with the fracturing of the Irish volunteers in that area, that this is to try and show that the Redmondites are supporting Redmond's war policy, and that some are prepared to go to the extreme of enlisting in the British Army. The police inspector in Enniskillen says that, well, these 60 men aren't really very impressive, but this is a start and it's worth encouraging and seeing what happens. The War Office, of course, which is behind all this in terms of recruiting, handles the Enniskillen recruitment with all the sensitivity that Irish nationalism could expect from the War Office, and that they decided that, well, yes, this chap Ray had raised 60 men, so they should commission him as a captain, and then the obvious thing to do would be to pack him off to the King's African Rifles. So he ends up in East Africa and loses a leg out there in the East African campaign, and then the file on him again is fascinating because he reappears in our story in 1939 when he turns up at the Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers depot saying that he's prepared to be the recruiting officer there, even though he's wounded and so on, and the army's saying, well, we only want this to go to retired regular officers, not this guy, can we get rid of him? And then the governor of Northern Ireland gets brought in saying, no, Ray is a loyalist Catholic and very well respected president of the local Royal British Legion branch. He will remain as the recruiting officer in Enniskillen, and they only got rid of him in 1941 when they closed the Enniskillen recruiting depot and moved everything up to Omagh. So someone whose belief of a sort of nationalist cause within the British Empire wasn't even dented by his own pretty miserable treatment in the First World War. It's also a little odd, I should say, where these men end up. They're enlisting in Ulster, but they don't go into Ulster regiments. They go into either the 6th Royal Irish Regiment, the one that Willie Redmond serves as a major in, or they go into the 6th Connaught Rangers. So this seems to have been against fears that the Royal Irish Rifles, Royal Enskilled Fusiliers, Royal Irish Fusiliers were all identified with the Ulster Division, and a concern that nationalists were going to be shoved into the Ulster Division whether they liked it or not. And of course makes things very difficult for some of the later formed elements of the 16th Irish Division, particularly the 7th and 8th Royal Enskilled Fusiliers, who are then left without a corridor. You would have thought the obvious thing to do would have been to have packed Ray and his 60 men off to that battalion and used that as a base to recruit from, but the War Office doesn't work things that way. So I'm not trying to run down the numbers here. The best estimate that the British government puts together is that the Irish National Volunteers provide something like 32,000 recruits to the British Army. So, and by no means saying that nationalists do not enlist in the British Army. What I'm saying is that they don't enlist in formed units in the way, or formed groups rather, in the way that happens with the Ulster Volunteer Force, and that the 16th Irish Division ends up really with one of their brigades, the 47th Brigade, the first one that's raised, which can be linked to the Irish National Volunteers. The other two brigades don't really have that very firm link, and end up with a lot of fairly apolitical recruits from the start. This process had of course moved on even further by the time we got to June 1917. By the time of the Battle of Messines, both the 16th Irish Division and the 36th Ulster Division had received a lot of drafts from England. There's a number of men who write about being London territorials who are drafted into the Ulster Division and say they don't get much of a time off it. They're treated as conscripts, but they're not, they're volunteers, but they don't really get a great reception there. And also by June 1917, the 16th Irish Division had two regular battalions moved into it, the 2nd Royal Irish Regiment and the 2nd Royal Dublin Fusiliers, largely because the recruits weren't coming in Ireland, and there was a need then to bring that division back up to strength. And what you're getting there is the old sort of professional corridor, which saw itself as non-political, with what are thought about generally as sort of apolitical recruits. There is a debate there about how politicised men thought that they were. Of course, most of these men wouldn't have a vote at this time. That doesn't come in 1918, so there are questions about that. But certainly the 16th Irish Division, by the time of the Battle of Messines, certainly in 1917, arguably even from its formation, doesn't reflect Irish nationalism in arms in a way that the Ulster Division reflects Ulster Unionism in arms. So that's a major myth to think of there in terms of the political equivalence of these two divisions and how we can match that up. Another one to think about to do with the idea of the sort of peace myth that we've got is how these men actually got on together at the front. The idea that we get to do with the peace term, peace pledge and all this sort of thing is that these men from the 16th Irish Division and 36th Ulster Division are getting on very well together at the front. And indeed I always thought it was rather odd that you would get some would push this thing who would also be enthusiastic supporters of the European Union, who then seemed to think that, well, it was all right that Irishmen were getting on so well together in Belgium and France, even though they were there to kill Germans. You know, that seemed a rather odd view of how a peace process could work. But actually, there are problems with that assumption that men did actually get to know each other well on the Western Front. The opportunities for men of the 16th Irish and 36th Ulster Divisions to mix were actually a lot more limited than anyone allowed. Certainly by the time of the Battle of Messines, you have the two divisions in the line together, and that pretty much continues up until the German Spring Offensive in 1918. It hadn't been the case at the Battle of the Somme, of course, where they served in different sectors of the front line. But that didn't actually mean that they mixed very much, because they were going back to different divisional rest areas, different bars, different baths, cinemas, concert troops, all that sort of thing. Very little sense that the men in the ranks got to mix. Where officers got to mix, there were some accounts that officers of the Ulster Division would have some officers from the 16th Irish Division over to dinner and vice versa. But the sort of thing you get is, well, we had Willie Redmond over to an Ulster Division dinner, seemed a very nice chap, bon vivant, raconteur, all that sort of thing, but no suggestion he was really winning anybody over with his views on home rules, so I think we have to be careful about that idea. Actually, amongst the ranks, there are a couple of good examples of where things really didn't work out terribly well. There is a good account by Lieutenant Colonel Fielding, who's an Englishman brought in to command the 6th Connaught Rangers, part of the 16th Irish Division, and he recounts a football match between the two divisions, and said a wag on the Ulster side was heard to say, "I wonder if we shall get into trouble for fraternising with the enemy." So no great sense that this was a meeting of minds there. And Dennis Rice, who's again sure that innate sensitivity of the War Office in dealing with Irish nationalism, he's a South African who was brought in to command a battalion in the 16th Irish Division, the 7th Royal Irish Rifles. He had this wonderful story where he said that the 16th Irish Division officers' mess had run out of soda water for their whiskey. Obviously this was a critical situation on the Western Front, and sent over to the Ulster Division mess to get some brought over. And when the bottles arrived, they were boiling water. So this had obviously been sent to really offend the officers of the 16th Division. And it turned out a couple of the officers had to go and explain, no, this was the boiling aerated water works in Belfast. There was no political symbolism to this. It was the only soda water they had. But it shows you if an incident like that risked a riot, it suggests that things were not going terribly well. There are also a few examples you get. There's a Lieutenant Witherow who's in the 8th Royal Irish Rifles, who's out on a trench patrol in no man's land, strays into the 16th Division area and is put under arrest. It takes Captain Stephen Gwynn, MP, serving in the Irish Division, to get him released. So, not a great sense that things were really going terribly well there. I'll turn now to say a bit about Willie Redmond himself. I've touched on him a little in terms of his book, Trench Letters from France. It's a very interesting case for those of you that have been out to the Western Front, because we end up with, sorry, wrong slide. We end up with Redmond in what's talked about as a lonely grave. It's up at Locker Cemetery. I don't know if many of you have got there or not. I got there for the first time earlier this year, actually, with my colleague Mark Connolly managing the maps. I never managed to find it before that, but it does sit quite close to Locker Cemetery, L-O-C-R-E, or Locker, L-K-E-R, in Flemish now. And there's a whole saga about this, which I'll cover in a little detail for you. The papers on it are all in the Commonwealth War Graves headquarters, who are now developing their archive and opening them to the public. So if you want to follow the whole story there, it's actually quite well covered in Terence Denman's book about Denman, The Lonely Grave, where he got to look at the Commonwealth War Graves papers but doesn't reference them properly, but there's a lot of interesting things in there. If we're thinking of Redmond, then we get the journalism, we get the book, we get the push that Irishmen would come together in the trenches. But there's a bit of a problem with that as a myth too, in that it tends to see Willie Redmond as a great conciliator, and there's not a great deal of evidence of that. The same myth we get for his older brother John Redmond as leader of the IPP, where he's often portrayed as a sort of proto-John Hume figure, someone that sort of bring people together and didn't really care if his own party lost votes in the back of it. Redmond is quite unusual then. He seemed to be on the extreme side of the Irish Parliamentary Party. There are a few accounts of essentially fisticuffs with Ulster Unionist MPs in the House of Commons, so you're not seen as a terribly moderate figure that way. But he does have a background that means that he can get commissioned in the army. He had served in the Wexford militia very briefly back in the 1880s, and on the back of that he was able to get commissioned from the off. A rather awkward business where a number of Irish Parliamentary Party MPs who want to go in the British Army are told they're going to have to serve as officer cadets. Now, whether they're told, yes, nominally you'll have to serve as an officer cadet and you will become an officer, or whether they are actually put through the training mill is a little unclear. But Willie Redmond is commissioned straight off, initially as a captain and then promoted up to major. If we're thinking about his vision, I have a reference here, which is when he speaks to Captain W.T. Collier shortly after the Battle of the Somme. He talks about things in more detail. He says, "I do want to see a united Ireland. As you know, there's a big gulf between South and North, between Catholic and Protestant. Catholic as I am, I want that gulf to be bridged over, and I believe it can be. I've worked for it all my life. Out here is a golden opportunity. Here we have two whole divisions, the 16th Irish Division representing the Catholic and the 36th Ulster Division. At present, these two divisions are kept severely apart on the traditional assumption that they would fight each other like wildcats if they came into contact. While I am exerting the utmost political pressure to bring them together because I believe they would do no such thing if they were fighting side by side against a common foe. It would be the first step towards the ideal. And then goes on to say that this would be, shaking hands with the Ulster and County Corps coming together with Ulster and so on. So that gives you an idea of the vision there. When he's commissioned, Redmond is posted to the 6th Royal Irish Regiment, which actually brings in a lot of recruits from the Derry City Irish National Volunteers, so there is an Ulster link there. But for most of the time, Redmond is carrying out an ill-defined staff job, as Denman puts it. Redmond is in his early 50s when the war breaks out, and that's pretty elderly for a company commander. So it seems that a lot of his time is spent over at headquarters, basically dealing with food supplies, and then after the Easter Rising, it seems that he's particularly put in charge of morale issues to try and keep an eye on things there and try and buoy it up. And I always think somebody to feel a bit sorry for in this context is Lieutenant Colonel Edmund Roach Kelly, who is the commanding officer of the 6th Royal Irish Regiment at the time of Messines, and he's confronted by Willie Redmond, 30 years his senior, coming to him to ask can he be permitted to take part in the attack with his own battalion. And it's a bit hard to say no to somebody old enough to be your dad, who's also the brother of the Irish Parliamentary Party leader. So Redmond is allowed to take part in the attack. Originally the idea is that he's only meant to take part with one of the reserve waves, I think it's the 3rd wave he's meant to go over the top with, and that once the battalion has reached the first German line, he's meant to get back to headquarters. So he can say that he's taken part in it, but he's not meant to get himself in any danger. Supposedly this is because Willie Redmond had received lots of letters from people in Ireland, and there's no archive of his, I should say, that survives, but supposedly he'd received lots of letters that had accused him of cowardness, had said that he encouraged all these men to enlist in the army, but then he had got himself a nice comfy staff job behind the lines and he wasn't in any danger. So it's partly to counteract that he insists in taking part. So the battalion, the 6th Royal Irish Regiment, goes over the top at 3:10 AM on the 7th of June. By 3:30 AM, Redmond had already been wounded by shrapnel. His men actually carried on with their attack because they didn't think he was that badly wounded, and he's then found by Private John Meakin from the 11th Royal Skin Fusiliers. You have the graphic novel there that allows you to follow that case there, and this again can be used as a sort of peace process bit in that we've got Meek from the 11th Royal Skin Fusiliers, seen as a convinced unionist, I think described in some accounts as an Orangeman, though I'm not actually sure about that. And Meek is the man who then finds Redmond, alerts a stretcher bearer party from the Ulster Division about him, and Redmond is then brought back to the Ulster Division's clearing station. The whole business of the burial then is rather odd. Redmond himself dies the night, I think, of the 7th, largely one of the surgeons says because of loss of blood, that it's, they think it's basically shock, and say that if it had been a younger man, he would probably have pulled through, that loss of blood, the shock, is what does for him. And of course, some did say that, Willie Redmond was a man who was a bon vivant as well as a raconteur, and that he'd lived well, so this had all sort of come together when he was wounded. He speaks to an Anglican chaplain asking him to write to his wife, but he dies soon after that with the 108th Field Ambulance. And he's unlucky really in that because in his battalion there had, well, I'll not say only, but there had been 3 other officers that had been killed. So compared to what happened in the Somme, the chances of putting through as an officer at Messines were pretty good. We then have the situation where late on the 7th of June, an ambulance from the 16th Irish Division collects Redmond's body, brings him back to Locker, which is where the 16th Division had their officers' mess established. The headquarters mess was there, so the idea was that this was a link to where the division had been based, and also the convent that it was connected to. Willie Redmond's niece had been a nun there before the war, so there was quite a good sort of family link with that area. So the Divisional General, W.E. Hickey, manages to get a coffin, very unusual thing to find in the Western Front, for Redmond. One thought is that Fielding, who was the commanding officer of the 6th Connaught Rangers, had a premonition that he was going to be killed and had made preparations. And that's why there's a coffin available, because as you know, most of the other soldiers don't get buried in coffins, it's simply ground sheets. So he then gets buried in what then is the garden of the convent at Locker. And quite interesting, if you're over at Ypres at the Flanders Fields Museum, you can visit their archive, and they actually have the visitors book for the grave, which makes for interesting reading because you get a lot of visitors during the war from the Irish regiments, but also from Dominion units. A lot of interest from Australian soldiers particularly, and going to visit the grave. So it's a very, very instant memorial that draws a lot of people in from very early on. And when the body's buried, there's a volley fired over the coffin with a guard of honour drawn from the 2nd Royal Irish Regiment and from the 10th Royal and Skin Fusiliers, so 1 battalion from the 16th Division, 1 from the 36th Ulster Division. Willie Redmond's wife then, Eleanor, she's happy with these arrangements, and she visits the grave in October 1919. She gets a special pass to go out, because those of you that visited the battlefields will be conscious of what the situation's like. In October 1919, farmers are starting to come back, but this still looks like cemetery, charnel house, scrapyard, minefield, all rolled into one, so there are very few visitors that early. But Eleanor gets a pass to go out and visits the grave, and this seems to have been engineered very carefully by Fabian Ware, who was the head of the Imperial War Graves Commission, because he wanted the body to be brought within Locker Cemetery and thought that if Eleanor got to see the situation, she would be happy for the body to be moved. But she's not happy with the situation and the idea of moving things, and says that she's perfectly happy with her husband's body being left in good care of the nuns. William Archer Redmond, MP, who is Willie Redmond's nephew, and had also served as an officer in the war with the Irish Guards, he wanted the body left where it was, or said that it should be returned to Wexford for burial. And of course that's another big problem for the Imperial War Graves Commission, because the agreement was that bodies would all be buried in situ on the Western Front, that they wouldn't be repatriated in the way that the Americans and French did it too. The Belgian Minister of War also gets involved and approves the individual grave, because this was another sort of legal sticking point, that in Belgium bodies weren't meant to be buried in private property, it was only meant to be in approved cemeteries. And then Eleanor herself pays for the cross that's there now. And of course this is another big difference for British soldiers in the Western Front, that when you go around the cemeteries there, you don't have the cross as a symbol, it's the grave headstone that then means that you don't spot the difference between different faiths as they're buried nowadays. Everyone's treated equally. So this is unusual with both that, and then of course the wayside shrine erected behind it too. So the situation then doesn't really change much for many years, but in 1956 the grave was visited by the Royal Ulster Rifles Association, and they wrote to the Irish Independent newspaper saying that the grave was almost lost in long grass and brushwood and was being neglected. 1958 then, the nuns left what was by that stage a hospice, and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission started to maintain the grass path to the grave, so that there were sort of problems coming up there. And then in 1967, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, after a great deal of difficulty, tracked down 2 grandnephews of Redmond. And I think that's a terribly interesting comment on the decline of the Irish Parliamentary Party, that 50 years after Willie Redmond's death, people weren't sure who was left of the Redmonds, and they weren't. One of them was actually in Australia, one of the grandnephews. They agreed that the body should be moved into the Locker Cemetery. The grandnephews signed that off, and that's the legal position as it stands now. Commonwealth War Graves says that if they wanted to, they have the legal permission to move the body. But at this point, the big kick-up was actually by the local parish priest in Locker, an 83-year-old parish priest who got the bit between the teeth and said that the people of Locker had looked after the grave and would continue to look after the grave and didn't want it to be relocated. And then in Ireland the opinion was rather divided, The chairman of the Royal Irish Regiment's Old Comrades Association wrote to the Irish Times, and he said, Redmond's life was devoted to the unification of his people. Why should he now be separated from his comrades who fought with him to achieve this? So he was obviously very supportive of the idea of moving the grave. Dennis Gwynn, who was the biographer of John Redmond, called for what he called an Irish response. And Brigadier General Dorman O'Gan, who had been Chief of Staff to Auchinleck in the Desert Campaign before embracing Irish republicanism, opposed moving Redmond's body. So there was a bit of a sort of public backlash both in Belgium and in Ireland itself. And then in June 1967, to reinforce this, on the 50th anniversary of Redmond's death, there was a service at the grave attended by many Belgian politicians, including former Prime Minister, by many Belgian Prime Ministers can you name, and veterans of the 16th Irish Division. And so that sort of reinforced the idea of leaving the grave where it was. And at that ceremony, the Soldier Song was sung, so there was an attempt to make this a sort of recognised Irish government tribute almost. So the Redmond legacy is certainly an odd one. I think that in terms of myths, we shouldn't perhaps see Redmond as much of a bridge builder as sometimes made out. And I think one of the reasons why the grave is so well known is it's one of the, I think perhaps only two, of a British soldier that is buried apart from a plot or from a wider cemetery. So there's different reasons for people to be interested in that. In terms of the myth of shared sacrifice and hands across the barricades, if we like, I'll turn now to say a bit about the Peace Tower at Messines. Of course, the more famous tower that some of you will be all too familiar with is the Ulster Tower at the Thiepval in the Somme, which of course is one of the earliest British war memorials to be built on the Western Front. That's back as early as November 1921 that it's unveiled. So that sits at odds with the Messines Tower, which is unveiled on the 11th of November 1998. It's modelled on the 7th, 8th century Irish towers that you get. Glendalough, I suppose, is the best example of that. And it's 32 metres high, 1 metre for each Irish county, so there is perhaps a little more thought in the design than was originally apparent. It was an initiative of a couple of different groups, and I'm conscious I'm being recorded here, so we'll play things a little carefully, shall we? It's an initiative of Paddy Hart, who was the former Fine Gael TD for Donegal, and then Glenn Barr, who was a former UDA spokesman up in Londonderry. Glenn Barr is often described in some literature as a trade unionist. It was a little different from being a trade union organiser. And the origins of all this seem to have lain in a 1996 trip, which included leading Ulster loyalists, David Irvine, Glenn Barr being two of them, and the former Taoiseach, Garret FitzGerald. Out of that came something called the Journey of Reconciliation Trust. If you Google that online, you won't find very much about it, which says something. And there was a budget of £150,000 provided by the Irish government to build the tower. This was then dedicated by a ceremony in November 1998 by Queen Elizabeth II, President Mary McAleese, and King Albert II of the Belgians. So that can be said to lay the groundwork for later peace process measures. Queen Elizabeth II's visit to Dublin, meeting with Mark McGuinness and so on. Some have said that this lays the foundations for that. And I was over at the National Archives in Kew giving a talk last year to do with the Easter Rising, and former President Mary McAleese was there and seemed to take it a little amiss when myself, Richard Grace and a few others suggested that really this hadn't contributed an awful lot to the peace process. She obviously saw it as a very important part of her legacy. But I think that this was quite an odd endeavour, and it's more obvious, I think, if we have a look at this peace pledge. I'll come on to that in a moment. The peace pledge, sorry, hopefully we brought it up. There's part of this which has, yes, as Protestants and Catholics, we apologise for the terrible deeds we have done to each other and ask forgiveness. So of course many that visit there don't really think that they committed terrible acts against anybody else during the Troubles, and this doesn't really resonate with many. So what we have is a rather odd endeavour of the Irish government trying to reach out to Ulster loyalism, and I think there's very little in that that appeals to mainstream Ulster Unionism, much less Northern nationalism. So in terms of the sort of peace building process, it's quite an odd endeavour there too. A cynic, and those of you who know me know that I'm nothing if not a cynic, would also note that this is an attempt to remobilise the dead in favour of a Northern Ireland peace process, and it's notable that the Loyalist paramilitary parties couldn't mobilise too many of the Protestant living to support them, so this was an approach where they looked to the past for support. There are any number of problems, I think, with the site and with the tower as it currently stands. The site, of course, is where the New Zealand division served, so it actually serves to give you a false sense of the location of Irish units. There's a question about what it's actually there for. There's no museum, there's no cafe, and of course a cafe is a very important element of any museum or memorial these days. There have to be the practicalities dealt with. There are no facilities at all, in fact, at the Peace Tower. So if you turn up with your, say, 25 undergraduate students who have been making a bit of a pigs of themselves with Belgian lager the night before, you have to make a few detours before you get there. And indeed, if it's a wet day on a battlefield tour, you don't actually have anywhere to stand in. Really, it's a very small enclosed space. You can only get into the ground floor of it. You can't get up to the tower, but even when you get into the ground floor, all that you've got there is Ireland's Memorial Records, or at least the volumes of it that haven't been stolen. Anytime I've been there, there's only been 3 of the volumes of 12 were done Ireland's Memorial Records. So there is a problem in what you can actually do at the site. The building itself is impressive, I think, but that also comes at a cost. Many thought that the stonework there looked rather more impressive when it was Mullingar Workhouse, what was meant to be a Grade 2 listed building, which was brought down overnight to find the stonework for it, so problems there. I've said a bit about the politics already. Very odd, I think, how this peace process, or peace pledge rather, was used, resonated with few, and there were no other major speeches made by the heads of state on the unveiling, so that seemed to be an odd sort of comment in the whole thing. And of course, things we could say were moving on, that when this was set up in 1998, there seemed to be an idea that you had to have some sort of other space where those from north and south could come together and commemorate the Great War. By 2008, of course, we were finding Tom Hartley's endeavours had led to the situation where you had a Sinn Féin Lord Mayor of Belfast laying a wreath at the Cenotaph in Belfast. So that sort of peace process element on the home front moved ahead very quickly and perhaps rendered this redundant rather quickly. And then, of course, there's the finance of all this. The Journey of Reconciliation Trust seems to be defunct. They're involved in a new peace park process, and certainly it seems that a lot of the work that was done in building the tower was carried out by youngsters on various youth training programme activities in Londonderry, and that I think is problematic too, because one could say that training unemployed youngsters to build a 7th century Irish stone tower wasn't really the most useful thing they could do. There's not a lot of demand for these things around the place now, and actually it's not terribly well built if you have a look at it. The photograph there isn't clear enough to show you, but there's an awful lot of cement packed into it, and the stone that's actually used doesn't fit together very neatly. So in terms of building project, we could wonder a little bit about the mechanics behind all that and what trades were actually being taught. And then, of course, this was becoming very run down very quickly. As early as May 1999, Jim Hunston, who was a school teacher from Surrey who had brought a group of his pupils over, was writing to the Irish Independent, claiming that 95% of the trees were dead, the grass was knee-high, and the Book of Condolence was missing. He continued, on reflection, the occasion, by which he meant the dedication on the 11th of November 1998, was drowned in a sea of self-congratulatory claptrap and empty political rhetoric and hyperbole. So that was a pretty damning indictment on it. And certainly any time I've been up at the tower, there's been nobody much else there. You maybe notice another carload, but it doesn't seem to get that many visitors and is rather off the beaten track. I've talked unconscious for 15 minutes, so I'll say very little about the idea of the two other sort of wider British Army myths. The British military incompetence myth is one that has been very much overturned in the past 20 years. There is an idea that the British Army was learning something about the First World War and how to manage things and how to develop. And if we think a little bit about that in terms of what was going on at the time of Messines compared to the time of the Somme, there are a few very positive things we can look to. One of the major ones is that the casualty rates at Messines were much lower than at the Somme. At Messines, the Ulster Division lost about 1,100 casualties as opposed to 5,500 at the Somme, so 20% of the casualties of the Somme. For the 16th Irish Division, we're looking again about 1,000 men killed at casualties at Messines, killed and wounded, not killed, as opposed to around 4,300 at the Battle of the Somme. So you get a sense there that things are moving on. This is not to say that only 1,000 men or so were killed in each division at Messines, but compared to the bloodbath that was seen at the Somme, then that's progressing on. The problem, of course, if we're thinking about this learning curve idea, is that the casualties at Passchendaele are equivalent to the Somme, so things get worse again. And the losses in the German Spring Offensive in March 1918 are also very bad. So this idea of a learning process, learning myth is problematic. Cyril Falls, writing about the Battle of Messines in his history of the 36th Ulster Division, said Messines was the first completely successful single operation on the British front. It shares with the action of Malmaison, fought 4 months later, the distinction of being the most perfect and successful example of the limited offensive. And if we're thinking of the differences between the Somme and Messines, that's a key one, that the area that's being captured is about 2 miles of an advance. That's the fold-out map from the Ulster Division history. This is 2, 4, that's 600 yards. So you can see, if you put that together, we're looking at a very limited advance. So whereas at the Battle of the Somme, the idea on the 1st of July had been for a breakthrough and sort of keep going until they got to Berlin. By this stage of the war, the idea is to capture German lines, wreck defences, consolidate, and then move on again. The idea of bite and hold, as it's sometimes called. And that's helped in any number of ways. There are a large number of mines that are used at Messines. There's about a year's preparation in putting those together, 21, 19 of which go up at the right time. There's very good staff work for the Battle of Messines. Plumer, the commander of 2nd Army, and Tim Harrington, his chief of staff, are seen as an incredibly effective team who sort out all sorts of problems to do with logistics and are very much revered, it seems, by the men who serve under their command. Indeed, one other general said that if you had a division that had been badly battered, you put it in 2nd Army under Plumer and Harrington, and they were as happy as sandboys in a matter of weeks. They got a sense that these were commanders who really cared for them and looked out for them. So there's good staff work there. The artillery is much better as well. There's more of it and it's heavier. And they're also starting to work out air reconnaissance properly. So the headquarters of the 16th Irish and 36th Ulster Divisions are getting photographs each day of the 6-day bombardment to show how things have got on, and they're able to say, right, this strong point needs to be retargeted. So there's very effective observation for the artillery. You have some use of tanks, although the idea of the tank in the First World War as a war winner is something to be a little wary of. One of them does help out a battalion of the Ulster Division, but it's said that a sergeant only manages to summon its aid by rapping on the side of it with a Mills hand grenade to make himself heard. There are no radio communications with tanks, so I don't think rapping things with the grenades to be recommended, but that's one way of it. And another one to think about is the organisation of the British Army. You've got the reorganisation of the platoon system, so that you had rifle grenadier sections and you had Lewis gun sections, so there's a lot more fire that could be brought on enemy strong points. And in the advance of the 2 divisions, it seems that a lot of these strong points were taken out with rifle grenades once they got to the 3rd and 4th line. So at the time of the Somme, they would have relied on artillery and have been desperately trying to get messages back to get the artillery up and to do something to help them. At the time of Messines, they were able to use the rifle grenades quite effectively, so important changes there. I've talked a lot longer than I hoped to, so I think I'll end there. Basically to say, I suppose that a number of these myths are out there. Most of them have kernels of truth within it, but hopefully I've done something to expose some of them for you, and I'll very happily take any questions you have now. Thank you.